Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We are so delighted to be here with you in our beloved Gann Chapel. We're taping this on Wednesday, April 17th. This is showing this Shabbat today, which is Shabbat Hagadol, or Shabbat Haggadah, the Shabbat right before the first Seder, which of course is Monday night, April 22nd. And for our Shabbat Haggadol conversation, I wanted to share with you something that when I read it, I thought, oh my God, this is it. This is it. William Blake talks about you can see the entire world through one grain of sand. So last week, Sara Labaton, who is the director of learning and teaching at Hartman, North America, was doing a lovely session at the shul about Pesach Torah and Purim Torah, how the two spring festivals speak to our moment. And she had in her thick packet of really rich sources a story from Etgar Keret that she didn't really have a chance to read. There just wasn't enough time. But when I read this story, I thought, this is it. This is the grain of sand through which you can see so much of the Jewish condition and the Israeli condition right now. The story is that Etgar Keret is a great Israeli writer, writes a story called Plague of the Firstborn, in which he tells what it must have been like for Egyptians to go through the 10th plague. What would it be like if you were an Egyptian, you've been through 9 plagues, and now you're an Egyptian and the 10th plague comes, and there is no home. There is no home, aim by it, where there isn't a death of the firstborn. What would that be like? And he writes this in a collection of short stories that came out in 2001, and he's describing a few years ago, in 2015, why he wrote this. And he says the following. He says, you know, I'm quoting, from very early on, the Egyptians just suffer and suffer and suffer and suffer, and then they drown. And he explores these sympathies in this short collection of stories. In other words, he's saying he has an instinctive sympathy in the Passover story for the Egyptian. This Israeli writer's sympathies are with the Egyptians. And his explanation, again, I want to quote this, and the word that's the grain of sand is the word just, as in only. From very early on, the Egyptians they just suffer and suffer and suffer and suffer, and then they drown. And hence, he is instinctively in sympathy with them. And the entire story, as you know, if you've read it, speaks from an Egyptian point of view. And the leitmotif of the story is that the God of the Hebrews is cruel. The cruel, powerful God of the Hebrews. The powerful, cruel God of the Hebrews. And the question that I want to talk about is, why is it that an Israeli writer would lop off the slavery part? Like when he says that they just suffer and suffer and suffer and suffer and drown, we know that that's objectively not true. Before they do that, they enslave our people for 430 years. Before they do that, their taskmasters whip our people. We know that from the Torah, because when Moses comes out of the palace of the Pharaoh, he sees a taskmaster whipping them. The Torah says, avodah kasha b'forech, with great rigor and discipline and vitriol and pain. And we know that they built the pyramids, slave labor. Why does an Israeli writer lop that off, and hence not see the 10 plagues as a just war being justly fought for the liberation of his own people? And the echoes of that for our time are just so obvious. So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we'll get into it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו לעסוק בדברי תורה. וערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. So, dear colleagues, what was your reaction to this story of an Israeli writer who does not even see Israelite pain, who willfully blinds himself willfully blinds himself to Israelite oppression for 430 years and focuses only on the 10 plagues as the action of a cruel Hebrew God.
Okay, I'm sorry, Michelle. So I was just thinking that it is really complex because, maybe the average Egyptian wasn't so involved. The average Egyptian, not like the South in the United States, the average Egyptian did not have slaves. And of course they saw the slavery, but it was not sort of part of their daily routine. If you were living in the city where you saw the slaves building the pyramids, fine. But if you were pretty much any place else in the country, and that was probably 99% of the population, they weren't there. So I can almost get the idea, taking it down to the individual family level, where the people that are suffering from God's wrath may not have had anything to do with it. And this is wonderful quote in the packet that you gave us. It says, "It is naive to think that the defeat of evil comes without cost." And so the cost is that innocent people will suffer for the actions of the greater powers that be.
I just want to quibble with the whole question.
Please,
right?
Quibble away.
Because
Quibble away.
I don't think that the fact that he sees the Egyptians suffering means that he does not see the Israelites suffering. I think
Can
there
I quibble
are
with
ways.
your quibble? How could he talk about the cruel God of the Hebrews? Why cruel? Why not the liberating God of the
Because
Hebrews?
it's not
That's
liberating
not this
to them.
story. But also that's not this story, right? There actually there is a broader and bigger view that I think our tradition actually challenges us with, and it challenges us with it every Pesach. So how do you see and experience and understand your own suffering and the redemption that occurred that was necessary and that was important, while still holding the fact that there's also a story of suffering?
But Michelle, to quibble with your quibble, he doesn't see the larger story of freedom and emancipation and also deals with the suffering. All he sees is the cruel God of the Hebrews.
No, all this story is talking about is that. And I think it's important because each of us have the capacity to tell different stories at different times and different moments. In fact, our Haggadah asks us specifically, we're going to look at these two, we're going to look at these four, we're going to see different narrative voices in different moments. And Etgar Keret, although I have some issues with his story itself that we can get into later, I think he's making the choice to say, I want to give voice to something that we don't normally talk about.
And it's so important because I think that in our trauma, in our loss, in our pain, we often only see our story. The easiest default position when you've been traumatized, when you've been hurt, is to only see the injustice that's been done to you and not understand the other things that are happening around you.
So, Michelle and Lisa, can I ask you a question? And I don't think this is an unfair analogy. Let's say there was a work about the liberation of Auschwitz or liberation of Dachau or the liberation of Majdanek. How would you feel about a story that focused on the pain of a German family that had lost members of its family in the war to the Nazi regime? That feels to me like the exact comp.
So actually, that's
Like,
been
I
one
don't
of
care about the Germans who died.
So actually, it's been one of the challenges of our history and our reconciliation and our understanding of rebuilding bridges with the German people.
Right.
In our family, we've had German au pairs for actually a number of years, and have had, and it's a joke in our family. Usually on the first day, we tell them our Holocaust story of our family, and then we actually hear the story of their grandparents who were in a village somewhere and not part of the Hitler Youth, or maybe even were, and how they experienced that war. It is actually not to excuse Not to excuse, not to forgive, not to make okay, but to simply say that if you want to build a future, we do have to understand an aspect of our Pharaoh story that's really hard, which is that that Pharaoh is the one who makes all the choices, and it's not always true that every single Egyptian was deserving of the wrath that came down. And that's something we have to grapple with, and that our texts ask us to grapple with.
There's also another level, which is that they've done really important research on perpetrators and victims of trauma. And both the descendants of perpetrators and the descendants of victims exhibit the same psychological symptoms, exhibit the same kind of inability to trust and to love, exhibit the same sort of family fractures, exhibit the same sort of anxieties. And so on a psychological internal level, we find out that whether you're on the oppressor or the victim side of trauma, you are suffering. And I think that this story says, like, hear the suffering, hear the pain. We're not just trapped by the chains that hold us. We're not just trapped by the enslavement. We're also trapped by our inability to see the suffering around us. And when we can hear that, then we can overcome this thing that's holding us all back.
Oh, wow. It's just so, can I just pause and note? It's just so interesting, the different reactions of our clergy team. Like, I was appalled. I was appalled by this story. Like, what business does he have talking about the pain of Egyptians when it was our people that were enslaved? And why couldn't he at least drop a footnote? Hey, by the way, dear reader, I know that we were actually enslaved, and I know that this is a just war by a God who liberates us, and I know that's why we have the Seder and the Haggadah to talk about a people that was enslaved for 430 years, finally getting freed, but also innocent people suffered. And there's none of that whole prologue. I think I could have been more okay with the story if he had dropped a footnote. Instead, it's just the cruel God of the Pharaoh. Wait a minute, a cruel God of the Hebrews inflicting pain on the Egyptians. And in fact, the cruel God of the Hebrews is the God who brings us from slavery to freedom. And I couldn't understand why an Israeli writer couldn't drop that footnote. So hearing your reaction is just so interesting. Elias, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've been trying to contain myself about what to say.
Don't contain anymore.
I have to be honest with you. I'm always grateful since, it's a paradox, but since the times of COVID, I'm really grateful that you decided to include all of us, because I feel that I grow so much as a clergy person, learning and studying with all of you. That being said, I couldn't get through this reading.
Tell me more.
Made me sick. I wanted to throw up.
Thank you. Tell me more.
Horrible.
Tell me more.
Horrible.
Thank you.
Horrendous.
Elaborate. Don't
In
hold
this
back.
day and age, this is the last thing that my heart needs. You know, it's horrendous. Focusing on the hearts of our enemies. Ridiculous. I'm sorry, I'm not saying that you chose a horrible topic to discuss. I'm saying that the text is horrible by itself.
Right.
I mean, there is no place for me at this moment to go through this.
So
Right.
that's
Absolutely
why
nothing.
it matters so much. That's
Right.
You know where
actually
my
why it
heart
matters.
is? You know where
Right.
my heart is these days? It's a little irrelevant, but it's relevant as well. For many decades, there was a leader of the Jewish community in Argentina who was the president of the Keren Kayemet, the, how it's called? Jewish National Fund, the Zionist organization in Argentina, very well known. He made Aliyah to Sderot, and his two sons in their late 30s, they are hostages, okay? The two brothers are hostages. He hasn't heard from them in 6-7 months. The guy is destroyed. He made Aliyah with the ideal that Argentina, he did enough for the Jewish community, he did enough for the culture of Argentina to bring understanding and tolerance. Time to go to make Aliyah.
Yeah.
That's where my heart is, not in this.
Can I just go with your heart for a second? You know, Danny Gordis wrote a piece about the unbearable sadness of being in Israel, that it's a sadness that's too heavy to bear. It's a heaviness that's too heavy to carry. And he tells the story of, he was flying from New York to Tel Aviv last Wednesday night, and behind him is Natan Sharansky in the line, and they get on the plane, and in the moments before the flight, we've all been there, Sharansky starts talking to the parents of Hirsch, the little redhead. and he says he sees the right, and he's talking to the parents, and he sees them intently in conversation. Natan Sharansky, who is redeemed from his prison, as Danny puts it, and these parents of Hirsch who are not redeemed. And Danny's heart, and Danny says that that's a heaviness that is too heavy to carry, and that's where Israel is. So in the face of that heaviness, which you gave expression to, which is where I live, that's why I find this story focusing on the pain of the poor Egyptians who, enslaved us for 430 years. That's why I find it really challenging. And now, of course, the reason why we're talking about it is it's not about the 10th plague and it's not about the Egyptians. It is about our kids and our people today who are just so heartbroken about the Gaza pain when we have so much pain ourselves.
So you, first of all, you chose to bring this reading. So
Yes.
I want to locate your pain.
Yes.
Right, in a sense of self-exploration.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to hear why, given how challenging and that you don't feel like there's a place for it, why you wanted to talk about it. But I'm going to sidebar that. I'm going to sidebar that for
Let's
1
not
second.
sidebar it. I
No, we'll get back
front
to
and
it.
center it.
Just we'll get back to that. But it's really important. This was written in 2015. Right, and I actually do think
Well, the story was written in 2001, but his lens was
even
written about
even more.
2015,
The story
yes.
itself was written in 2001.
Right.
Right.
As I understand it, yeah.
There are many people. It would be interesting to ask him today, right, whether he would have brought this story to this time, whether his ideas, his thoughts have changed, and it's important for us to be consistent about our thoughts, and it's equally important to us to challenge the thoughts that we had and felt before, right? It may be that in 2001, he felt this way. We might have been able to see it with a cool lens and just explore this story, as we often explore the question of that culpability there. And maybe it's important to us to hear that. Like when we were cold, this was a value for us.
Right.
Now that we're hot, maybe we need to hear it.
Right.
Right, it may be that this wouldn't be the same story.
But
So
I
speaking
also
of, can I just take? I just want to engage your always thoughtful contribution, Michelle. How do you when I shared this with you, it was before Saturday night and 330 missiles and drones. By the way, if you feel comfortable sharing, your parents were actually in Jerusalem. If you feel comfortable talking about what it was like for them Saturday night, and what does that, we are a people besieged. We are a people beleaguered. We are a people in a really bad neighborhood where our enemies are emboldened. I just don't get caring about the pain of the enemies. I just want to survive. So how does Saturday night and 330 missiles and drones, how does that affect how you see the story?
How is there only one choice, right? I think if you ever want to build the Yerushalayim Shel Mala, if you ever want to have the possibility of the city of peace, that our suffering needs to be put out there in the world. It needs to be heard. It needs to be understood. We need to feel it and prioritize it. And that means that we also have to see that we're not alone in the world.
Rabbi Michelle, would you include this in your seder?
This? No.
Oh, okay.
Right.
All right.
No,
Okay.
but it's a class today.
Okay. Can I bring some light here? I want to find some middle ground.
Hold on, but before you do, could you just talk about Saturday night for your parents? They were in Jerusalem,
look,
and talk about how that shapes how you see this whole cluster of issues.
With so many of our people, when Saturday it's hard to breathe when you're awaiting missiles coming from Iran. We don't know what will happen in this moment. It's terrifying. They can only hear what they hear from their safe rooms, so you can hear the explosions. You don't know if those are the Iron Dome succeeding, yay, or if they've fallen somewhere on somebody else, you have no idea. And they wake up in the morning, and there's a world to build again, and that world asks us to grapple with all of our traditions' wisdom, including that that our pain is so loud. Of course we can't hear. And yet our tradition definitely asks us in the midst of that, when the next day comes, not in that moment.
Right.
Our tradition, the whole thing about, the Egyptians, my creatures are drowning, we had a
Right.
whole class on that, right? That's for the angels. That's not for the humans. The humans experience, it's all about me.
Right.
But there is an angelic voice that asks us the day after or the day after that to try to reach beyond ourselves so that we can build a different future.
But I have a really different read of this story, and I think
Okay.
it's key to this, because I actually think he's doing something very smart with this story. The end of the story is that their deepest pain comes not from the cruel Hebrew God, but from the betrayal of his family.
Yeah, talk about
And
that.
that is a really important thing, because it's actually not that he's not hearing the suffering of the Jewish people, and it's not that he's not understanding what's going on. What he's saying is,
Right.
here's a people that blames their entire suffering on this cruel Hebrew
Right.
God, who's actually not that cruel, who actually hasn't touched their family. But wait, what has touched their family is this man who spent his entire life trying to set up his family and trying to build roots and trying to build a home and trying to set up his life. And then he finds out the ultimate betrayal is his wife has had another child, and he is totally at a loss.
So-
And it's not the cruel Hebrew God. That cruel Hebrew God is an excuse for the pain that he really feels.
Okay, so Eliza, thank you,
That's
and bless you. I want to talk about the end, because obviously the end is a total flip. Would you read the end?
Yes,
For
with
those,
pleasure.
right, the 10th plague, and it turns out that their oldest son survives because he's not the firstborn. So if you'll read that from Abdu, which is the oldest son who actually survived the 10th plague, if you'll read that last paragraph.
Abdu was still dazzled when Mother let go of him and approached Father, who was standing in a corner, his eyes to the ground. "Did you see what just happened?" she whispered. "A great miracle. The God of the Hebrews has taken pity on us and on our son." Father peered straight ahead. His pain gave way to ill-concealed rage. "The God of the Hebrews harbors neither pity nor compassion towards us," he fumed. "Only truth. Only truth." His bloodshot eyes were like 2 hailstones, and his gaze filled me with greater fear than all 10 plagues. "Why are you angry?" Mother asked. "Why do you not rejoice? Our Abdu is alive." "Because he is not your firstborn." Father cut her short. He raised his hand as if about to strike her, but froze in midair. Mother fell at his feet and let loose a sob, as of one who has suffered an invisible blow. Thus did the 4 of us stand, motionless, steady, and transfixed, like a cedar about to be felled. "Cruel indeed is the God of the Hebrews," Father said. Then he turned on his heel and left the room.
Thank you for the reading, and thank you for drawing our attention on it. What's the meaning you make of that flip ending?
So, to me, this feels like a really important narrative for us, for everyone, which is that the enemies that you perceive aren't always your enemies. Throughout this story, there's this sense of this cruel Hebrew God that's out for them and that is causing them to suffer. When in actuality, it's the family that's been torn apart before he even knew it. And the greatest suffering is caused not by the cruel Hebrew God, but the cruel Hebrew God is actually creating punishments that exist in the world. It's his own loss of trust, of faith in his family, his own crushed illusions of the family that he had built.
So, Lisa,
So
I have only one problem with that, right? The last line that the father says is, "Cruel indeed is the God of the Hebrews.
But that's
so the
sarcastic.
leitmotif.
I actually thought you were going in a different direction because to me, this encapsulates the entire roots of anti-Semitism, right? What is anti-Semitism about? It's about finding the Jewish people and blaming them
For your
for all
problems.
of your problems, right? And in fact, what's so subversive about this seen through your lens, thank you for bringing it, Eliza, is that even when he knows the reality that his suffering was not caused by
He's
the
still gonna
God of-
blame the Jews.
He's still going to blame the Jews.
He's going to blame the Jews. It was his wife who betrayed him. It was his wife who committed adultery. It was his wife who broke up their family.
God.
But cruel indeed is the God of the Hebrews. He still blames the Jews. So to me, I read this as saying, I mean, perhaps if you want to read it as he's wry and ironic and satiric, okay, that's your prerogative, you know. But I think the pshat is exactly that the leitmotif of the story is cruel indeed is the God of the Hebrews, and even when faced with contrary evidence, he blames the Jews and their God. So I want to come back to you, Elias. What sense do you make of this whole posture? And of course, it's not just about a short story. It is about our kids and our people who are somehow drawn at least as much to the suffering of Gaza civilians, and clearly it's horrific tragedy that has befallen them, right? It clearly, they have suffered mightily and horribly for the sins of Hamas, clearly. But the question is, to whom does your heart belong in this horrific season of war?
Yeah, I mean, I wanna bring something to the table that is important. Well, there is no table here. Anything. We have I want to ask you, start with the thought, but then ask you a question, Rabbi Michel. We have during the Seder the phrase that I love, and I always loved since I'm a kid, which is part of the Al-Ahmaniya. Kol difhin yetei v'yechol, kol ditzirich yetei v'yitzach. You are better than me with the translation. Everybody who is hungry, come and eat with us. Okay? And just a beautiful story short. Mikey, my son, I'm only doing this just to brag about my son, he plays in the jazz band of Columbia. Okay? And he met a wonderful Christian boy who plays saxophone. They became very close to each other. And then one night, the guy asked him, Mikey, you know, what are you doing this Friday? Well, I'm going to be leading a service, a musical service at the Hillel. What's Hillel? Can I go? Can I join? He went. Second time, he asked if he could play. He wanted to play with Mikey in the band, in a Jewish religious service. All right? To me, the invitation is for them. All right? For anybody who has a good heart, who wants to learn about our tradition, who wants to be friends with us, not the people, you know, closing off the bridges and chanting death to America, death to Israel, and nobody condemning anybody, the representatives in Michigan. You know, that produces me the same thing that this produces me. Okay, that being said, Rabbi Michel, I have a question for you. This coming Monday, we are going to have the fast of the firstborns. Okay? And correct me if I'm wrong, the Lord Nesson.
You're wrong.
That we do a piece of study that usually you do masterfully in order to avoid us to fast. Right. And what is the reason for fasting? To sympathize with the firstborn of the Egyptians. If we are really trying to do better, wouldn't it be better for us to fast and not to avoid that?
Great question.
It's a wonderful question, Elias. I actually think in your question itself, you bring up that core challenge, right? Our tradition is always pushing us further to try to balance the real world that we experience, the horrors of our past that are inexcusable, and the horrors of our present. You know, at JCDS, my son has his milestone, 4th grade milestone, on Friday morning, and they're singing Vehisha Amda, right? And he says to me, do you know that when they wrote this, right, it says not just Amad Aleinu, but Omed Aleinu. It says not in past tense that they tried to kill us, but today they're trying to kill us, and that's real. That's real. And So we have to see that. We have to look at that. When Iran is sending missiles, that's our focus needs to be on us, our people, our suffering, our understanding. It's 100% legitimate that our blood boils here. And our tradition says that in all of that, you are also more. You're also more, and you have more capacity, and you can see suffering, particularly of innocence, right? Not of the leaders who caused this, but of innocence. And don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid to make room in your heart to say, yes, I need to survive, v'chai behem, and they matter, and I care about that too.
So, colleagues, thank you for a really wonderful conversation. Let me leave you all with a question to which I don't have an answer, but it's a question that I have been obsessed with. I usually feel like when we're in this conversation, especially Michelle and Eliza, that your soul is much better than my soul, and your soul is much more humane than my soul. And I usually feel like my soul has been broken by this conflict, and that my decency and humanity is gone, and I'm very tribal, and I'm very lizard brain, which is where I live mostly. And I admire your ethical sensitivities a lot, and I wish I could emulate them, and I can't, and I don't, but I admire yours. The one question that I have been dreaming about and obsessing about is the question of healing, which is, Shira and my family and I went to Japan, and we went to Hiroshima, and we saw, monuments to the dropping of the atomic bomb on August the 6th, 1945 at 8:15. And basically the bomb exploded in middle air. It didn't explode on contact, and it was a bright light, and then it burned everything and everybody within a wide radius. And the monuments, like when we do a monument and we want to show that we're there and we're thinking about our loved one, we put a stone on a stone. In Japan, throughout Hiroshima, they put water bottles, because the people who were incinerated first were burned and were dying of thirst, and then they died of thirst and of fire, and just horrific amounts of suffering. And there's a whole museum which shows you the artifacts, and there's a lot of kids who were incinerated on August the 6th, 1945 by the American bomb. You see actually like the lunch pail that a young boy would come to school with, which was, and you see the burnt remains of it, et cetera, the clothes, et cetera. I bring all this up because despite dropping an atomic bomb on Japan, there's healing. And Japan and America and Japan are partners, and we felt love, and they speak English, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Two, the same kind of thing in Vietnam. After all the horrific war in the Vietnam War, there's McDonald's and Starbucks and every American company in Vietnam, and we're welcome there. Three, you think about, this is the 30-year anniversary of Darfur, and the Hutsis and the Tutsis. And after genocide in Darfur, I listened to a whole podcast about the healing that has happened there, right? So I'm kind of with you that in the fullness of time, the kind of healing that happened in Japan between Japan and America, that happened in Vietnam between Vietnam and America, that happened in Rwanda between the Hutsis and the Tutsis, could one day happen here, that kind of healing. And for that kind of healing to happen, being able to see each other's pain, which you've been talking about since October 7th, would have to happen. And I guess my question is, when will that ever be possible? When will that ever be possible? And will that ever be possible? And when I think about Yerushalayim, Bashana Haba Yerushalayim, the kind of Jerusalem that I dream of, and here is, I want to just thank one member of our shul who said that for their Seder this year, their theme is that to be truly free is to be free of hate in your heart. And maybe if we could be free of hate in our heart, then we could see the pain of, and then we could have the forgiveness, and then build a better world. So I suppose my prayer for us, certainly my prayer for me, is to be freed of the hate in my heart that blocks me from seeing the pain of others. And if we could all do that, maybe through the power of seeing and loving and forgiveness, we could build a better world. The pathos of this moment is that just seems so very, very far away. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. We wish you all very loving and meaningful Sedarim.